All right, I'm cutting off those back 2 rows. So Liz, why don't you come up here? We got a good seat for you right there. I want you guys to make it feel lonely out here just because we got sports. I know the DECA group went off somewhere. All right, anybody have any questions? All right, so we're just going to wrap up this chapter, what is it, 27, whatever we're on here. That's something on the show later anyway. Chapter 27, and it's our main market that we use to try to identify predictions. Connor, I'm cutting off those back 2 rows, so come on up. So we got to have the basic tools under our belt. So we've got the shifters and the players, and then we're going to look at some theories, and then we're going to be done with this chapter, but that's not going to end there, because we're going to continue to work this model the rest of the semester. So this is an important one. All right, so why was this one vertical? A long run aggregate supply curve. Why was it vertical? What's that? Good, good. So back to kind of, anytime you see this type of graph, it means that the 2 variables are unrelated to each other. So that's kind of the math view of it, but more importantly, the economics interpretation would be what? What is our potential output for the economy based on? What is this kind of maximum potential that we expect to be in the long run? What is that based on?
Real GDP.
Real GDP? That's what we're identifying, is that it's maxed on, but that's not what it's based on. What is that potential real GDP based on? What determines whether this is 1,000 or 1,500 or 900, or, you know, the placement of this curve? I could have drawn it anywhere, right? We're saying that this identifies the potential for the economy. What's that based on? What's that? That you're kind of saying the same thing over and over. That is the potential of the economy. Potential what? Potential real GDP. What's GDP? Gross domestic product. What's gross domestic product? Gosh, I'm having to really chip with. I feel like I've got this mountain of knowledge that I'm just trying to chip like a big ice block here. Chip. Hopefully nobody comes through there. What is real GDP? What is gross domestic product? Dollar value of all final goods and services produced within the nation's boundaries over the course of the year, right? So that's the final, all the final products that we like. When we think about the things that make us happy, some of the things in the marketplace is the final products here. Pizza, shirts, basketballs, the final goods and services, the things that bring us some happiness. Now, that's not the only thing that brings us happiness, but that's the material things that bring us some happiness, right? So we're saying that quantity of stuff, there's only so much we can do. Back to my original question, what's that based on? No, it's from a theoretical standpoint, I'm just looking for what are the things that create limitations on the amount of crap we can have. Resources. Yeah, it's in this picture actually, right? So this is what I was trying to depict here in figure 2.3, is that we've got resources in the economy that need to be transformed into something that brings us happiness, right? So that production process is the physical thing that goes on day in and day out. I tend to get hung up on prices, but money doesn't matter. At the end of the day, money doesn't matter. Money is the veil to the economy. Remember when I talked about parting the curtain? Money creates a veil for what's really going on in the economy. What's really going on is we've got a fixed amount of land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, and we don't really care necessarily about those things, but we'd like to have the things that can make. That's this. That's real GDP. We only have limited resources. This is really getting back to the basic concept of economics, trying to satisfy unlimited wants with limited resources. Resources are limited. We have to make choices. We have to make decisions on what to make. Now, that, conveniently enough, ends up being our shifters. What makes this move to the right? What makes economic growth? An increase in resources, an increase in capital, an increase in labor, an increase in educated labor, right? Education related to labor, human capital, an increase in natural resources, an increase in technology. So that's what is the ultimate driver of economic growth. That's what this thing is based on. And so at the end of the day, prices don't really matter when we pull the curtain and look behind the curtain being the pricing system and money. When we part the curtain, the economic reality is that we are physically constrained by the number of resources and technology available in the production of some amount of goods and services. Andrew?
So on the short run aggregate supply curve, what's the difference between the factors that would cause it to move upwards and downwards and the factors that would cause the slope to change?
Okay, so there is a slope with it. Let me ask first, you're getting into the short run aggregate supply curve, which is where I was going to go next, but any questions on long run aggregate supply? So kind of think back to the production possibilities frontier, which showed the maximum combinations of two goods an economy can produce given its available resources and technology. Very close definition, in a sense, to this long run aggregate supply curve. It was based on resources and technology. Economic growth was a shift outward of the production possibilities. Here we were talking pizza and beer. Here we're talking all final goods and services. Okay, so back to the short run. So there's a possibility of a positive relationship between higher prices and more final goods and services under the assumption that resource prices remain fixed. So the production costs remain fixed. So that's where we got into the assuming that resource prices stay at $10 for labor and whatever capital, rental rates, all sorts of resource prices. I just put this one kind of for convenience purposes of thinking about resource prices. When those are held fixed and the prices at the shelves at Walmart go up, Walmart's able to produce more and more goods, right? They're able to provide more goods when prices climb from I'm just going to say $100 to put it in a micro perspective to $108. Walmart's willing to bump up production, right? That's kind of the microeconomic story. But since this, from a macro perspective, is inflation, and inflation is going to put pressure on resource prices as well, when resource prices adjust, this model, we show that as a shift to the left. Now, you brought up the slope.
Yeah.
Okay. So the slope of the line was something I mentioned with Keynes last time. So what was Keynes' theory about resource price adjustments? You might have, were you here towards the end?
Yeah.
Andrew? Last time?
Yeah.
Okay. What is Keynes' theory about resource price adjustment? What did he say about wages? We had kind of a little buzzword for you to remember. Sticky wages, right. So resource prices were especially rigid in the downward direction. So Keynes envisioned a short-run aggregate supply curve that was probably flat, which gave a little bit more fixed to the price level being a little bit more sticky, with resource prices being sticky. All right, so the less sticky they get, the steeper it gets. So I'm kind of jumping the gun a little bit, but I talked about the Austrian school, which is kind of more in what we call the classical school of thought. If resource price adjustment happens fairly quickly, pretty rapidly, then it would be more steeper. In fact, some economists would argue if they're fully flexible prices, they're one and the same. It's real steep. So prices adjust right away. Resource prices and output prices, for the most part, adjust very quickly in the economy, and therefore there is no distinction. So there used to be this textbook doesn't do it this way, and I never really liked this anyway. I'm happy with it. But there were textbooks that showed the aggregate supply curve like this. And this captured kind of the classical economist, the classical view, with fully adjustable prices. Both resource prices and output prices are just humming along as the economy, as people make individual decisions in their lives. We see resource price adjustment and output price adjustment. The Keynesian school would be more over here. So Keynes had this flat one, and that's what we were depicting by this flattening out. So in reality, that slope may change due to circumstances in the economy, which kind of maybe gets back to a little bit more of your question, that the slope could vary depending on circumstances too. That help?
Yeah.
Okay. I was just kind of doing this for, that's not something you need to know for this test on Sunday, so. Other questions, comments? All right, so our basic model, we just kind of have a shortened aggregate supply curve with some sort of slope to it. The most important point is that along the shortened aggregate supply curve, resource prices are held constant. All right, so that lag time is created. All right, now we've got an aggregate demand curve. And the aggregate demand curve has all of the agents in the economy, because we can think about some aggregate demand shifters as the players. So kind of think about, or I'll put recall here since we did it this way. Our expenditure approach helps us remember the agents in the economy. We've got domestic consumers. Remember, Y made up 70% of GDP. It was the largest factor. So I knew there was something wrong there. I put the Y. That's a C for consumption. Now we have the Y over here, but now in this context, we're thinking about these guys are the demanders of this stuff too. So we've got domestic households. We've got businesses who want to buy capital, machinery, and equipment in additions to their business. It also included homes, remember. But we've got that type of decision going on. We got government spending, weapons of mass destruction, and we've got the foreigners. What we import versus what we export. Net exports, exports minus imports. All right, so that kind of helps us with these primary shifters. And so I'm going to do this a little bit differently than what I gave you before. It's really a repetition of the stuff. But so I'm going to start you off with thinking about expectations, because that's what's we're going to roll into next week and look at how important expectations are. If you expect more income in the future, so this little E is the notation, I think we've used it already before, expected income. If you expect higher future income, do you tend to spend more today or less? More, right? You guys, as college students, are especially probably doing this. You're hoping that you're going to be making more money in the future, so you're willing to still spend some more today. You're not really worried about saving too much. Lance, I cut off those back. Actually, you too. Sorry, I cut off the last two rows. You guys get to come up nice and tight today. Looks like there's a spot next to Jacob. Liz has got a spot. Stephanie's got a spot. I didn't want to feel lonely today. There's a lot of activities going on. All right, so increase in expected income, an increase in the price level. If prices are going to be higher tomorrow, do I buy more stuff today or more stuff tomorrow? If prices are expected to be higher tomorrow, should I buy today or buy tomorrow? Today, right? So that's going to lead to an increase in aggregate demand. So expectations about prices. Also, how about, I wanted to make sure we make the connection here. An increase in the price level expected also means that it's the same thing as saying there's an increase in inflation, expected inflation. So expected inflation is your expected future level, new number minus the old number divided by the old number, right? So that is how we calculated that way back in the early chapters of macro. So those two things are kind of one and the same. An increase in the expected price level means that there's an increase in expected inflation. Those are one and the same. But your homework problem or test problem could be worded either way. Caroline, I cut off the back 2 rows. Come on up. Stephanie's got a seat. There's another seat next to Liz. And then finally, profit expectations. Expected profits. So business profits. As businesses expect more profits, do they expand buildings and machinery and computers, and right? They start to reinvest in their business, right? So they look for expansion opportunities. So all of these things, any one of the things all lead to an increase in aggregate demand, a shift to the right. And then, of course, bear in mind that if any of them fall, if there's a decrease, if it's going the other direction, it's supposed to be increased. If it goes the other direction, then aggregate demand is going to shift to the left. All right, so that's an important role of expectations. Questions on that? Number 2, we spent a lot of time last time looking at fiscal policy. Fiscal policy was the president and Congress. If there's an increase in government spending, more weapons of mass destruction. This was the example we went through with Trump increasing military spending by 20%, an increase in G. If there's a decrease in taxes, that would lead to an increase in aggregate demand. So more people have after-tax income for spending is one channel of that. If we were looking at corporate taxes for corporations, lower corporate tax would, again, be more profitable for them. And so therefore they might look to expand their business, buy more machines, buy more buildings. And then finally, increase in transfer payments, which we'll spend more time on. Transfer payments, very similar to the increase in G, except here we're going to Guns R Us to buy some more weapons to kill the bad guys. Here, we're just handing out to folks. Handing it out to the old folks, handing it out to the poor folks, just handing money out, right? Take from the rich, give to the poor. So we're increasing transfer payments. So all of these things, again, lead to an increase in aggregate demand under the fiscal policy umbrella. Questions on that? All right, number 3, monetary policy. We spent our whole chapter on the Federal Reserve. And if they make moves to increase the money supply or decrease the interest rates, For interest rates, that'll make it cheaper to maybe get a car loan, a house loan, cheaper for businesses to go out and expand their business because profitability looks higher now that they can get a loan for that tractor at 3% rather than 5%. Again, it gives them some profit incentive. So we have people that are interest rate sensitive, that leading to a shift in aggregate demand. To the right, all of these being expansionary monetary policy. Number 4, this is our last one, exchange rates. We just came out of that chapter. The exchange rate E. If the dollar depreciates, so exchange rate was the number of yen per dollar, our E. If the dollar depreciates, what impact is that going to have on aggregate demand? So let's see, remember this is plus exports minus imports. If we kind of blow up that net exports. If the dollar has depreciated, what happens to aggregate demand? Zach? What's that?
I was talking about that.
You're talking about what you're going to do tonight, or what? What'd you say?
No, I was talking about, didn't you say that we can take a quiz over time to underscore it and show you?
Yes, I did. All right, so that was a side thing. I thought you were saying it up like you're telling me that aggregate demand go up. So, all right, so what's your opinion on this now? Now that you have time to digest that. So the dollar has depreciated. So the exchange rate has fallen. The dollar's depreciated in value. Is that going to tend to increase or decrease aggregate demand? Decrease? Okay, and why? What channel? What's happening?
I feel like the dollar can't hold its own anymore. It's not worth as much.
Okay, let's turn to exports and imports, because part of the reason I want you guys to have this kind of thinking is so that you can look back now and say, okay, the dollar's worth less. It's depreciated. Am I buying more Chinese plastic stuff or less? Less. So am I importing more or less? Less. Down arrow. Right? If this is going down, what's happening to the overall expression?
It's going up.
It's going up. Remember, this one's a little, because we're minusing something smaller, that's actually making aggregate demand go up. Right? So aggregate demand is going to shift to the right with that one. That one's a little bit tougher. So as the dollar depreciates, now what's happened to the Chinese yuan? If the dollar's depreciated against the yuan, what's happened to the yuan? It's appreciated. So now they buy more dollars with their 1 yuan. What's going to happen to our exports? It's going to go up. So we got both arrows moving in the right direction so that we can conclude that indeed a decrease in the exchange rate, a depreciating dollar, is going to lead to an increase in aggregate demand. A shift to the right. Okay, and then we also talked about foreign income. So here, remember the star is the foreign country, is our notation that we're using. So an increase in Chinese incomes, which by the way has been happening too. So China's becoming a little more wealthier and have a little bit more income. Their GDP is growing. So there's an increase in the Chinese GDP. Is that going to lead to an increase or decrease in aggregate demand? Channel back through this. If we're talking about a foreign country, we're honing in here. If they've got more money, are they going to buy more crap from us or less? If they have more money, are they going to buy more crap from us or less? More. They're going to buy more of our stuff which means our exports are going to go up. So that also leads to an increase in aggregate demand. Okay, so that's kind of a different look to the different things on the shifts that we need to have memorized for the next test. Questions? You guys got that down. And I know there's a lot here, but hopefully you start to kind of break it into its categories. Expectations, fiscal policy. What's fiscal policy? Oh, president, oh yeah, they can decrease taxes or increase this. Monetary policy, oh yeah, that's Federal Reserve, that's them doing that business with interest rates, and oh yeah, they can buy more stuff or less stuff. And then finally, the rest of the world. So now we've got things broke down into these 4 chunks, which hopefully makes it a little bit easier to compartmentalize stuff. All right. So let's wrap this stuff up with the schools of thought. Let's see. Let me get rid of this. So this is the last section of your book, and we've already talked about some of these, but schools of thought or macro. This is basically different theories. Theory on macro. So I'm going to start off with the classical view. The classical view. Maybe let's see, I don't want to put the screen down so fast. Let me put, and we did this a little bit with our growth theory stuff too, so you might remember some of these names. So classical, new classical, it kind of falls into the same categories, and that is that prices are fully flexible. Jesse, I cut off the back of the class, so come on up. Still got a hot spot here, and Jacob's got one, a couple, there's 3 different choices for you. So prices are fully flexible. And this essentially means that the lag time is basically nothing. So think of it as no lag time. Maybe I'll even put no significant lag time. How about that? No significant lag time between output and input price adjustment. So now, using our model, let's see what the implications of that are. So if you believe in that theory, then a change in aggregate demand that moves out to AD2 means we never get to, I'm going to go ahead and put point B, and then remember the economy's headed towards the intersection of what? Long run equilibrium means that where's the economy headed to if we were at B? So the current state of the economy was always the intersection of short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Where was the economy headed to with the invisible hand if we let prices do their thing? Where were we going to? The intersection of what 2 curves?
Back to long term.
Back to long term. So the intersection of what two curves? How do we get back to long term? Tell me where we're going here in this picture. Okay, good, Cameron. So the intersection of what two curves? Talk to me in terms of what's on the board here. Let's call this LAS1, SAS1, and AD1. Okay, yeah, right there. Right? So let your eyeball kind of go to that place is where the invisible hand of price adjustment, the economy, human action, in the long run, we're going to head to point C. Okay, so the story we told before is that if there is this lag time, and we kind of think about it, at least theoretically, as output prices at the shelves of Walmart go up, and then after some period of time, boom, resource prices change. All right? So then we move from A to B to C was the story that we were telling, leaving us at, oh, I don't know, let's call this, let's see if that's an 8, that might be a 5, I don't know, 113. So we're eventually going to get to 113. Well, neither Keynesians or classicals, for sure, believe that really. What's really going on is that some resources start to adjust right away, some resource prices. So I wish I had my other golf club, but somehow I left it, and I can't believe they didn't know it was mine, but I used to have 2 golf clubs. That was a regular thing. And sometime last year, I lost them. So you're going to have to bear with an arm now. But this is, so there's our short run. Here's our aggregate demand. The real world works like this. As this starts to get upward pressure, this one starts to drift up too. And so the actual path of the economy very well could be something maybe like this, as far as a trajectory. You with me on that? So if some resource prices, there might be some contracts or reasons why some resource prices may take a while to adjust, but not all resource prices. So as there starts to become inflation, some resource prices start to adjust. So really we've got these 2 curves moving at the same time, maybe creating a trajectory of the economy that looks like this, where notice we are getting a bump in real GDP as we move to the green part here, and then we're eventually coming back to the long-run equilibrium. So now our question with these schools of thought is, how long is that taking? If resource prices are actually fully adjustable and there's no significant change in resource prices and output prices, then our trajectory looks like this. We just move straight from A to C, right? So as this starts to go up, this one catches up pretty quick, and we're like this, right? Like sound effects work for me? Do it again. Right there, boom, you saw it. It just goes right up the line, and so the economy basically always stays at its potential level of real GDP. That was the conclusion that we got from the classical view. So one of the things that these guys maybe struggle with is that it implies economy is always at full employment. It implies that the economy is always at full employment. In other words, it's always at its potential. Aggregate demand goes up, so does resource prices. We stay right there. The economy really doesn't move off that spot. So this was the classical view of prices, but then the Great Depression hit. And we're like, well, that theory can't be right. You're telling me that when the economy has 25% unemployment, that we're operating at our potential? No way. And the fact that it stuck around for a while, right? That it didn't disappear. We went from that 30s time frame all the way into the late 30s before we started to see some improvement. And so that's when Keynes' theory came to life that we talked about. So I'm just going to give you a couple brief comments on that since you guys have some of it. So number 2 is the Keynesian theory. And Keynes' theory was it is possible to not be at full employment. It is possible to not be at full employment. It is possible to not be at full employment for extended periods of time. For extended periods of time due to sticky wages, among other things, but due to sticky wages and rigidities in the resource market. And then you can put in parentheses here, Great Depression. And that's when Keynes prescribed the government cure. Let's let the government do fiscal or monetary policy to kind of help fix things. If we're in that environment of animal spirits and sticky wages, let's use government policy to do to be active. So Keynesian theory was to use fiscal or monetary policy to stabilize the economy. All right, so then Keynes kind of dominated the discussion 1936 through the 1960s. So imagine we've got something that government bureaucrats and government politicians like to hear. Oh, we have to spend money to make the economy better. That was like music to their ears. They didn't want to listen to any other economist after that. They're like, that sounds like good. Some economist came up with that idea, that we'll run with that. And so Keynes' discussion kind of dominated really the world, but especially the United States history from 1936 through the 60s. So this theory dominates policy for the 30s, 1930s through the 1960s in the United States. All right, so then we're going to get into more details with this later. It turns out Keynes had some issues with that too, that we get some public choice problems with people making decisions that are in their own best interest rather than maybe the public interest, is one of the issues we run into maybe. And that concept ends up being inflationary. So as we continue to have the medicine prescribed by Keynes to something's wrong, juice it up. Something's wrong again, juice it up. Juice it up, juice it up, juice it up. Now, if the short-run aggregate supply curve is pretty flat, turns out you can juice it up without having the impacts of inflation potentially, it's possible that you could keep juicing up the spending. This happens slowly over time, right? So you got to imagine coming out of the 40s into the 50s and into the Kennedy era of the 60s. And so slowly but surely, we started to see more and more inflation, and then things got kind of out of control in the 1970s. And we started to drift back to looking at some of the classical principles. And now there starts to be this overlap between the two. So in the number 3, kind of new classical, I put new classical over here just so that you got the concepts down, and we're going to expand on this later. But new classical / Austrian economics was the video that we watched, / monetarist, which they enter the policy discussion in the 1970s. Where we have high inflation and low real GDP. So GDP growth kind of sucked, and we had high inflation. A double whammy, just opposite of what we want. What are our 3 policy goals again? Low stable inflation, low unemployment, high GDP or increasing GDP. Basically, in the 1970s, all 3 of those sucked. Because of what happened through policy that took a while to evolve through Keynesian policy, we ended up having high inflation, low GDP, and high unemployment, all at one time. And we're like, this is a friggin' disaster. What the heck happened to this theory that we've been banking on? Something went wrong, and then some other theories came out of those issues that we're going to explore next week. So we'll keep you posted here. So other theories evolve. Stay tuned next week. However, I do want to mention the monetarist real quick, although we'll talk more about it next week. But your book mentions them here. So I kind of led off with other theories, but let me do the monetarist. The monetarist view, because this is at the tail end of your book, they get into a few details, and we'll get more. So the monetarist view was money, changes in the money supply is the most important, is the most critical policy for aggregate demand. That's why we call them monetarists, because they really focused in on money. And Milton Friedman was kind of the leader of this. So Milton Friedman said, our best policy is a stable policy. In fact, no policy. He wouldn't have been a fan of some of the stuff that the Federal Reserve has done since the financial crisis. So Milton Friedman would advise a non-activist monetary policy is best for macro health. A non-activist monetary policy, which is kind of weird because it's like they focus in on money. Money's the most important thing. It's so important, don't mess around with it. Don't monkey around with it because you might be causing more harm than good, which kind of falls in line with that Austrian perspective of leaving a little more hands-off again, not anti-government, but anti-activist policy, that the government needs to play a big role in our lives, kind of tinkering with things. Okay, so in the classical view, the big takeaway here is we move from A to C very quickly. With the Keynesian view, in the long run, we are all, who remembers that one? In the long run, Keynes said, we're all dead. In the long run, we're all dead. He thought this was too long of a time. Didn't believe the classical economists. The classical economists say we move from A to C fairly quickly. Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead. That's not happening due to sticky wages. Okay? All right. That closes up that chapter. Unless you got any questions. This next chapter ties into it, so it's going to be good support for what we just did. The next chapter, which is next week's material, so this is it for Sunday, gets us into kind of the Keynesian model, the Keynesian details of how important spending is. So we're going to look at a focus on spending. And the belief was that we have some big benefits that come to us from some people's money getting spent over and over. Did anybody still need this? Are they still right? Oh! I'm not quite done. This isn't a big deal. Your book has a couple nice little pictures to maybe help motivate the aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Almost forgot. That's why I had this sitting out. Okay, so for those of you who aren't looking at your book ahead of time in the week, which is what I'd advise, you should find good support for the stuff we went through in class. Long-run aggregate supply, we got lots of pretty pictures and the shifts. And there's changes in demand. All right, here is the one I wanted to show you. One of them. This is kind of one way to think about tracking the actual levels in the economy. So this is the United States, 1960 versus 2016, 14, whatever we're at here, I think it was 14. So we can think about supply and demand moving up over time, and that's the path, 1975, 1982, 1991, 2009, and where we're at today in terms of the price level. So sometimes it's easy to get separated from reality, but this is when we start to learn the model to make predictions. But we can kind of think about this being the path of our actual economy as we move through time. Okay, so I thought that was worth kind of giving you a little look-see. Here's some more real data. This is the business cycle. Oh, that just reminded me of another thing I had to add. Forgot to mention the inflationary gap. Okay, so I mentioned recessionary gap last time. In fact, if you guys, yeah, the picture that I just had, I just want you guys to add one thing. I'm going to do this kind of sloppily. This is the picture you guys have. This is the current level of output, and this was potential. When the level of output is greater than the potential, we call it an inflationary gap. Inflationary gap. When it was below, we called it a recessionary gap. So just kind of add that. I meant to put that down on that last graph you just did. So inflationary gap. I see that. Any questions on that? Get a little bit nicer. So big recessionary gap, right? Financial crisis, 2008. The economy takes a big tumble. Here we're looking at the output gap, and this is a percent of the potential. So they're measuring it as a percent. So the baseline here is potential real GDP at 0. So prior to that, we had an inflationary gap. So we were looking like this picture. And that then we dipped down, came back up, and then we fell. Okay, questions on that at all? All right. Just another picture over the 4-year period, thinking back a little bit differently on full employment versus actual real GDP, thinking how on this picture it goes back and forth. You might have some homework problems or test problems that kind of have you look at it a little bit differently, right? So we got potential GDP. This has got GDP on the vertical axis and the year. So we're thinking about the swings of the economy. Inflationary gap, recessionary gap, falling employment. All right. Good. Let's see, anything else fun in here? I think that's it. All right. All right, so next chapter. Moving right along. Go orange. So this chapter is kind of focused on Keynes and the multiplier. Keynes and the expenditure multiplier. Keynes and the expenditure multiplier. So spending is kind of the key. Spending is the key in Keynes' theory. So we're going to look at, for starters, a consumption function. So imagine if we wrote consumption on the vertical axis, spending on new final goods and services, C plus I plus G plus X, that's the C, 70% of GDP. And if we put income down here, which is real GDP, but we use those two interchangeably, right? When we think about spending in the economy, our income, from the macro perspective, the income that we make from businesses paying paychecks, wages, rents, salaries, interest, profits, is equal to the spending that we do in the output market. So our income is based off of selling our resources, and that leads to us doing some spending. Positive, negative, or independent relationship? If we were to graph this sucker out, which we're going to do, A, B, or C in general? A, right? We get to buy more stuff if we have more income. We learned that when we were in kindergarten. Well, we might not have had income, but it was some sort of money in our grubby little hands. So, is it possible to have spending if you have zero income? Is it possible to have spending if you have zero income? Yes. How? That's true, it is. Loans. So from a micro perspective, you got loans, but remember from a macro perspective, one person's borrowing is another person's lending. So how else are we able to spend? If we don't, and remember, now we can think, let's say you make $40,000 a year. I'll try to give you guys more money. You make $40,000 a year and you lose your job. Is it possible for you to still go out and spend some money? Yes. How? Debt's one way, but I'm knocking that out. But you're absolutely right. At a micro level, debt would be one way. What else? Savings. Right? So if you were saving your money, that's not income. That's your money from a previous time period. Right? So last year I made $40,000. I saved $10,000 of it. So now when I'm unemployed this time period, it's possible for me to still do some consumption through my savings. And of course, maybe some other place, gifts were the other things, but one person's gift is another person's transfer. Is one person's, I'm trying to what I was saying, gift, it's kind of a gift on both sides. One person's gift is its gift. All right, so our consumption function looks like this, where even if our income is low, or nothing, if our income is zero, it's possible for us to have some sort of spending on consumption. And then as I earn income, I start to spend more and more of it, some fraction of it goes towards consumption. So we've kind of built what I call a consumption function. And if it's a straight line, which for simplicity we're doing, we can put it into slope-intercept form. Bring it into math. I hate to tell you, we're going to bring in a little bit of math this time. So let's call this vertical intercept A. So C equals A plus some chunk of my income. Well, how much is that chunk? Well, if I made $1,000, I'm going to spend some fraction of it. And if this number was 900 of that 1,000, what fraction of my income am I spending? %, right? So my consumption is $900. Based off of 1,000, I've got 90%. But is that the amount of my income as far as the total? Is it 90%? So 90% is part of the problem. It's not taking into account A, right? So in terms of this formula, we could say this was 90% of income, but that didn't take into account A, right? So we've got a little slope term that we need to figure out. So A equals something, and we're going to add on the amount extra that we go. So it's really 900 minus A. If we did a little rise over run would be 900 minus A over my run of 1,000. Right? So we call that your marginal propensity to consume. The slope of the consumption function is your marginal propensity to consume. There's your consumption function. All right, so let me write a little bit of this out. So, in a world with no taxes, not very realistic. In a world with no taxes and no imports / exports, I might as well throw that in there too. So we have a closed economy with no taxes. Our consumption function would be equal to that equation. If there was taxes, what would be the appropriate thing to do? We've kind of done this in some other, this isn't brand new, but if there was some taxes, what would we need to do? What's that buzzword for income? What type of income would we be looking at if it was income after taxes? Net income is one word, not the word we used, but it's fine. It's a fine word. It would be net income. We had another little buzzword for econ class that we did. No. Good guess though. So gross income minus taxes equals net income. Perfectly fine for accounting classes. It's just we didn't use that word for econ class. We had a special word for money that was left over for spending. Extra credit point.
Surplus excess.
Nope. Good try. Good try. Disposable. Bing, bing, bing. Disposable income. Who was that? That was Hannah? All right. Disposable income. So it's the money that we can dispose of as we wish, so to speak. Disposable income. Income after taxes. So with no taxes, that means that, disposable income equals income minus taxes was an equation we did before. If we have a tax rate, by the way, it's possibly T times Y. Let's not let these go too far under the rug, because now we're starting to get into some nitty-gritty details here. So total tax liability is big T. My disposable income would be gross income minus taxes equals my disposable income. But another way to think about it is to say my gross income times the tax rate, little t. So if the government was dinging me 20%, it'd be 20% times my gross income gives me, and if it was $1,000, 20% times 1,000 gives me $200 worth of tax liability, right? So this is another way to think about it. We use this thing for total tax, but this could be the way that it was collected if we're talking about tax rates, both of which would be fiscal policy. If taxes are gone, then these are gone, and disposable income is my gross income, okay? So we're just trying to simplify the world here a little bit. We're going to complicate the world later. That's why I'm kind of foreshadowing that. So in a world where there's no taxes and no imports or exports, so we have a closed economy, that would be our consumption function. All right, so let's kind of identify some things here. We got consumption. We've got little a, which we call autonomous, a new word that usually is kind of reserved for econ. Autonomous consumption. Autonomous. Autonomous. So autonomous consumption is just simply consumption that is independent of your income. So independent of income. It just kind of drops out of the sky. It's just there. really didn't drop out of the sky. If it was your savings, you did something before, but in terms of it's not related to your income at all. And then we got the two biggies over here. This is, I'm running out a little bit out of space. I'm going to cheat a little bit. You guys don't use arrows or something if you want. So the marginal propensity to consume, the marginal propensity to consume is the MPC. It's simply the fraction of our income that goes towards spending. So the fraction of income that goes towards consumption. Now, if we wanted to get a little fancy with an equation, our marginal propensity to consume is equal to the change in consumption divided by the change in income, which is really just our rise over run over here, right? So if we move from 800 and this was whatever, it's probably going to be terrible for a number. The change in consumption is 100. Change in income is 200. So I am consuming 50% of my income, right? 100 divided by 200 gives me 50%. 100 divided by 200 gives me 0.5. So my marginal propensity to consume using these numbers is 50%. Do you think our real marginal propensity to consume in the United States is 50%? Not even close, right? Now, how about China? Turns out China's closer to that, by the way. So there are cultures out there that are really good savers. Because if we're not consuming, we're saving. So we did that equation one other time too, was our, if we're not consuming, we're saving. I'll write that note here in a minute after I finish this up. So our Y is really our income. And then let me just make the note, it's really disposable income, which is Y minus T. It's really disposable income, income after taxes, but remember I said no taxes. All right, so let's see. I didn't do my board spacing very good here. This right here. Okay. So note. Our disposable income is either spent or saved. And this is the equation that we did back in the supply loadable funds chapter. So our disposable income, we either spend it or we spend it tomorrow. Spend it today, spend it tomorrow. So we think of savings being kind of future spending potentially. And so now that we have the income, we can also think about that fraction of our disposable income. So YD equals MPC times YD, ends up being our consumption, plus our MPS times YD. The marginal propensity to save, the fraction of our income that goes towards savings. All right. If we factor out that YD, we've got this. Doing a tiny bit of algebra, sucking the YD out of that equation, right? That equals YD. What does it tell you about these two things? I'm kind of pushing, this is kind of a little bit of a proof. I'm trying to hopefully get a good point home. I'm not really meaning to test your math skills. But if YD equals YD times this thing, if that's true, mathematically, back to X's and Y's, what must be true about the sum of these two things? It equals 1, right? So we're going to spend or save all of our income. So therefore, marginal propensity to consume plus the marginal propensity to save must equal 1. And now I'm trying to make this somewhat practical when you end up hitting a homework problem or a test problem. Sometimes they'll give you this, or they'll give you this. And you need to go either way, because as long as you have one, you've got the other now. So the marginal propensity to consume is also equal to 1 minus the marginal propensity to save. And that's the one I wanted to get to, because you might see that in your homework or test. But it's also important, I want you to kind of compartmentalize here that from our income, we're either consuming it or saving it. So it kind of has two parts to it. All right, questions on that? All right, so now we're going to add in some other junk here. So to build the rest of this model, we're going to look at all kinds of spending. So recall cigarettes. So in this model we had last time aggregate demand equaled that we could kind of think about cigarettes. Now we're going to think about spending. So aggregate expenditure, AE, can be thought of as equal to C plus I plus G plus X. I'm going to ignore this one for right now. So on your sheets, just kind of want you to do this. Closed economy. Let's pretend that we don't care about China and Japan, and we're really nationalist, even going way beyond Trump. We're just not only going to build walls, but we're never going to trade with anybody again. It's like illegal. You will be killed on a firing line if you trade international. Right? That's the rule of law in our land. Lord help us if we get to that point. But just to kind of help facilitate this, we're going to forget about the rest of the world is what we're saying, and we're going to operate in a theoretical idea of a closed economy, which as we said in the international trade stuff, that would be a really bad idea, kind of a super stupid idea, and let's hope that our president doesn't really think that that's a good idea. I don't think he does, by the way, but posturing or negotiations or something. All right, so we've got these down, and now we're going to put in the rest of this new consumption function. So C equals A plus, the C part equals A plus the marginal propensity to consume times our income. So that's the C part, plus investment, plus government spending. For simplicity, we're going to assume that these are also autonomous. We're going to put a little bar above them. In math class, that means it's fixed. And remember, this one was fixed too, it was autonomous. So all three of these are kind of related, they're just kind of numbers. So they're fixed. So this is autonomous. Don't know where it comes from, it just kind of drops out of the sky. But there's some amount of it. All right, so in our new model, we're going to have income, real GDP, measured on the horizontal axis. So you can kind of think of it as income. And now we're going to have planned spending, planned aggregate expenditure. And then I just want to redraw the consumption function, C. And this is little a. And my question to you is, what happens to this graph if we now add investment? We allow businesses to be buying machines and equipment. If we add that element and we say, suppose that businesses are buying $100 worth of equipment, what happens to this line if we add 100 to it, right? It goes up. Parallel shift, little slanty or a little flatty. So parallel, steepy, flatty. Steepy? What do you think? If we add in $100, so we're going to make it autonomous. So basically to this equation, I'm just saying, suppose we add $100 worth of investment. Frank's right, this is going to go up. And is the slope going to change? Is how I'm being cutesy with my steepy or flatty. It's just going to be a parallel shift, right? So all we're changing is the intercept. So now the intercept becomes A plus I bar. And I'll try to draw a parallel line, C plus I. And now if we drop in $50 of government spending into our system, again, it kind of just drops out of goods. We're going to shift the intercept up again, right? So we've now got, not really drawing this perfectly to scale, but C plus I plus G. And this is A, this intercept is A plus I bar plus G bar. And so if that number, whatever A was, all we're doing is we're adding those up. All right, so our expenditure model looks like this. We've kind of captured aggregate spending for the economy. Yes?
So then what factors could change the slope of the, if changing income government spending just makes it go up and down, what would change it?
Okay, so what is the slope, first of all? What is the slope of the aggregate expenditure line. Because it's a good question. What changes the slope? But let me step back and say, well, first of all, what is the slope? Yeah, in this equation, I mean, I've really just mapped out this equation right here, right? So this equals aggregate expenditure now, but it's got all these pieces to it. What is the slope of this line? It's kind of hard to see in here, but it's there. It's actually the same thing we did over here. I erased it already.
Just A.
No, it's not A. So A is the intercept. A is part of the intercept. What's the slope of the red line? Marginal propensity to consume. That hasn't changed, right? So that's what it was over here when we did the rise over the run. It was the change in C over the change in Y. That's the marginal propensity to consume. So at this point, we haven't changed anything there. So then to answer your question, what would change the slope? It would be anything that would change the marginal propensity to consume. The marginal propensity to consume did change with the financial crisis, for instance. So households who were spend, I'm an American, I want a big car, I want a big house, I want a big this, I want a big vacation, big. Spend. When the financial crisis hit, households tended to not spend as much. So if they were spending 95% of their income, maybe it cut back to 92% or 90% or 89%, right? So that's what would change the slope is something culturally happens. Usually it would have to be kind of a shock. Otherwise it starts to kind of change over time slowly, but it's pretty consistent. It's pretty consistent from year to year. There might be small changes in the marginal propensity to consume unless we get a big shock to the system financial crisis. Okay, any other questions so far? All right, so here's where we really get into the model. We need to think about what equilibrium is. And in equilibrium, our spending equals our income. Our planned spending equals our income. Need to get some refills going. There it is. All right, so the aggregate expenditure model, also called the Keynesian cross, for reasons we'll see in a second here. I don't think your textbook actually calls it that, but it's kind of a nice way to remember it, the Keynesian cross. So draw a nice big graph for yourself with income and aggregate expenditure, which is planned spending. I like to early on at least kind of write that words, planned spending. And before we draw that curve, I want to draw a different curve, a different relationship, and that's a 45-degree line, which is kind of a lousy line. I looked a little, might have got a little buzzed here on the way up to my 45-degree line, but okay. So that it kind of works there. Yeah, that's fine. It's not going to matter too much. But draw a 45-degree line. 45 degrees means you're, in theory, splitting it right down. You got to read that. Let me see. I don't know if I'm going to do any better. Okay. Now I'm a little bit too far this way, but that I'm going to stick with it. So 45-degree line. At any point along this line, what's true? The slope's the same. Yep. And what is the slope, by the way? 1. So it's rise over run would be equal to 1. So the slope's the same. And so what is that? What's the implication of that for these two variables on the horizontal and vertical axis? If this equals 1,000, what does aggregate expenditure equal? 1,000. So it's still just that 1-to-1, right? So it's just mirroring things out. Okay, so in a long-run equilibrium, those two things should be equal. Our income should equal our spending. Our income equals our spending in the long run. All right, so that's an important one. So 45-degree line. This is a reference line that shows a long-run equilibrium where income equals planned spending. Okay, so now we're going to lay on top of that our aggregate expenditure line. And so our aggregate expenditure line, I'm going to have it drawn right through here. Looks like this. The one we just drew, where we've got the autonomous parts of spending plus the rise of the run feature. All right, so now we can think about what's going on with the economy if we're not in equilibrium. So if we're not in equilibrium, let's start off with this point here. Suppose the economy is down here, I guess I'm going to call it 500. Is our spending above or below our income? Our actual planned spending. Is our spending above or below our income? Below. Let's see. Which one represents my planned spending? The orange or the black? The orange. So at 500, my spending is greater than my income. Okay, now this is where we got to back up a second and start putting on our hats on what's going on in the United States. We're buying more stuff than what we're actually making. So in the grand scheme of things here, remember that we can look at money flows, but we can also look at the flow of actual product. If we now think of this being as production, if we're producing 500 units, but buying more than 500 units, right? We're spending money on something more than 500 units. How the heck are we doing that? There is an answer to that. And it's kind of real world ties here. It's kind of similar to how you guys spent money when you didn't have the income. What did you do? What did you tap into, potentially? Your savings. Now, from a business standpoint, if we're Walmart, how is it possible that we're producing 500, but stuff is flying off the shelves at a greater rate than what we're producing? It's kind of like savings, but it's different. Put your business hat on. We're running a business. We make stuff. We've got 500 units in 2016. We made 500 units, but we sold 800. Stock of inventory, right? So it's kind of like that savings concept. So we're going to be tapping into inventory, right? So in our warehouse, we might have lots of inventory. I should probably bring back my Jack Daniels example because I always like that one. Those of you who had micro might remember. we got the oak barrels. If you go visit, if you get a chance to head over to Louisville, Kentucky area, and you can visit some of the distilleries there, they've got just lines and lines of oak barrels, all full of Jack Daniels or whatever. Jim Beam is another one. I don't know. Is that the same one? Yeah, I think it is. Okay. Jack Daniels, Jim Beam. Anyway. It's pretty awesome to see their inventory. They have all these barrels, as far as the eye can see, of inventory. Well, this is how they do it. They have stored up over time an inventory of barrels, and so this starts to go down. So when we're at a situation like this, what's happening to inventory? So what's happening to inventory if spending is greater than production? What's happening to stock of inventory? It's starting to go down, right? And so this is the business signal that it's sending. So at this 500 level, we have a decrease in inventory. A decrease in inventory. What does that signal Jack to do? Produce more, right? Increase production. And now look at what's happening in terms of our model. It was a disequilibrium, right? It wasn't sustainable in the long run. Eventually, you'd run all your inventory out. So when that happens, if our production is not meeting spending, then we're going to tend to boost up production. We boost up production, might mean I have to hire some people. When I hire people, when I boost up production, I need more resources to make that stuff. I pay people some paychecks. It starts to get things going in terms of spending again, right? So we start to head this way. All right. How about if we're over? At $1,500 worth of income or production now, if we're starting to think of it that way, how does my spending compare to my production? How do I tell the difference? So spending versus production. Spending and income, we kind of got multiple concepts going on depending on which one we're looking at. So we're making more than we're selling. So our production is too heavy. We're producing this amount. People aren't buying them, they're only buying this amount. Right? So we're producing more than we're selling. What's happening to inventory? It's increasing. So that sends a signal to the business owner, we got to put the brakes on this. We're not selling all that we're producing. We got enough here to sell for the next 2 months. Let's tell some people no overtime anymore, right? We're going to cut back on overtime. We're going to cut back on production. And so we're going to tend to head this direction. And so Keynes saw that these things were important to consider in the behavior of people was inventory. So inventory was one aspect of this. And so as inventory increases, that's going to cause you to decrease production. All right, so an increase in inventory signals to go back. Decrease in inventory tells you to ramp up for production. So this is all saying we're going to be moving towards that equilibrium. Okay, so let's put some of those notes here. So equilibrium equilibrium in AE model. So the equilibrium occurs where the AE line and the 45-degree line intersect. if disequilibrium inventory changes send signals to business to increase or decrease production. If disequilibrium, if we're at a point where that's not true, then we're going to have this inventory issue. So let's call this Y star. And maybe this is the potential level for the economy. Let's just go with, ultimately we're going to tie this back to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model too. And let's call this Y1 and Y2. And then I'm going to explain the whole inventory thing here. So, if Y1 is less than our potential, then inventory will decrease and producer will increase production, which is an increase in income. And then the opposite story, if Y2 is greater than potential, then there'll be an increase in inventory, and producer will decrease production. All right, let's call it a day there. We'll get into the multiplier business Monday. I thought I did. Did I send it around attendance? Yeah. I did. Okay, so it's back there somewhere. Oh, there we go.